Welcome to Brain Vision.
Question 8. Question 8 says, as described in the chapter, the Federal Reserve in 2008 faced a decrease in aggregate demand caused by the housing and financial crises and a decrease in short-run aggregate supply caused by rising commodity prices. Part A asks, starting from a long-run equilibrium, illustrate the effects of these two changes using both an aggregate supply aggregate demand diagram and a Phillips curve diagram. On both diagrams, label the initial long-run equilibrium as point A and the resulting short-run equilibrium as point B. For each of the following variables, state whether it rises or falls or whether the impact is ambiguous. Output, employment, price level, and inflation rate. All right, so here I've drawn two graphs and I state that there are two possibilities. I explain what this means in a while, but let's take a look at the first graph on the top left, standard aggregate supply aggregate demand graph. As always, the long run aggregate supply curve will be vertical. It will intersect the x-axis at the natural level of output y1, and the economies at point A, which is the intersection of AD1 and SRAS1. So point A is a long run equilibrium, and we know that the economy is facing a very negative shock in aggregate demand. So the AD curve shifts from 81 to 82 right here, shifts to the left. And on the other hand, we also have a negative aggregate supply shock from rising commodity prices. So the short run aggregate supply curve also shifts to the left from SRAS1 to SRAS2 right here. So the resulting recessionary equilibrium will be at point B, which is the intersection of AD2 and SRAS2. And this will result unambiguously in a lower level of output, Y2. So the difference between Y1 and Y2 is a recessionary gap. So here in the first graph, we can see that the price level will drop from P1 to P2. However, if we take a look at the diagram at the bottom, I've drawn exactly the same diagram, but with a little change. The aggregate demand curve shifts less as compared to the shorter aggregate supply curve, and the new equilibrium results again in a lower level of output, but results in a higher price level, P2. So we can say that the impact on the price level is ambiguous because it depends on the magnitude of the change of the aggregate demand aggregate supply curve. So if the aggregate demand shock is more adverse, the price level will drop. If the aggregate supply curve is more adverse, the price level will rise because companies will adjust their production plans accordingly to reflect this supply shock. So just for the sake of exposition, we're going to assume that the price level will rise because this is easier to illustrate in the Phillips curve diagram, which I have drawn here on the right. As always, the long-run Phillips curve intersects the x-axis at the natural level of output U1. The economy is initially at point A, which is the intersection of the long-run Phillips curve with the short-run Phillips curve, right? Point A is the long-run equilibrium resulting in an inflation rate of pi 1. And now, first of all, the aggregate supply shock, the negative aggregate supply shock will shift the short-run Phillips curve higher. So the economy and the policymakers are facing a less favorable trade-off between inflation and prices, meaning that for each level of unemployment, the prices will be higher, or for each inflation level, the unemployment rate will be higher. And since we assumed that the price level would rise, then the economy is going from point A to point B right here. First, the Phillips curve shifts, and then the economy, because of the aggregate demand shock, moves along the Phillips curve to the right. So as you can see, the lower level of output corresponds to a higher unemployment rate, and the increase in the price level also corresponds to an increase in the inflation rate. Okay, in part B, suppose the Fed responds quickly to these shocks and adjusts monetary policy to keep unemployment and output at their natural levels. What action would it take? On the same set of graphs in part A, show the results and label the new equilibrium as point C. All right. So as far as the aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve is concerned, we can draw the change in any diagrams. The result will be the same. I have drawn I've decided to join about the first one. So we know we are at point B, right? AD2, SRA is 2. We know that the Fed cannot influence the aggregate supply, but they can influence the aggregate demand. So what the Fed needs to do is engage in expansionary monetary policy, either by increasing the money supply or lowering the interest rate, or doing any combination of the two, or any other sets of policy tools like unorthodox, like forward guidance or quantitative easing. And so they want to shift the aggregate demand curve from AD2 to AD3, even higher than before, so that it intersects with a short run aggregate supply curve, with the second short run aggregate supply curve at a higher point. So they need to do all this shift in the aggregate demand curve to restore the economy back to point C, right here. In the same vein, we can see that happening in the Phillips curve diagram. We're at point B, and expansionary monetary policy will stimulate aggregate demand, and so the economy will move along the second short-term Phillips curve all the way from point B to point C, right here. Unemployment is back at its natural level, but the inflation rate will be higher. Here I haven't drawn it here, but there should be a pi 3 right here, as you can see. And this is related to part C, which asks, why might the Fed choose not to pursue the course of action described in part B? Well, we just answered it in a way that if they do engage in an aggressive expansionary policy, they will manage to restore the economy back to its natural level of output and natural level of employment, but this will result in a higher, possibly much higher inflation rate. That should correspond to something like P3 right here or pi 3 here. So the policymakers might deem inappropriate to accept such a high level of inflation in order to reduce, in order to close the recessionary gap, and this might be a reason not to pursue such course of action.